On Britain as a society, and that's what our Home Affairs editor Mark Easton looks at now.
The name Stephen Lawrence has come to define a watershed in British cultural life.
What do we want?
Justice!
When do we want it?
Now!
His death was not the first nor the last murder of a young black man blamed on racist killers in South London. But the case entered the wider public consciousness because of two people, Stephen's parents, Neville and Doreen.
I have one more son, and how safe is he going to be until these killers are being caught?
For the first time, the British public saw parents, a family whose grief was so patent and whose dignity was so clear that everybody could identify with them. White Britain realised that actually black Britain and black Britons aren't really that different.
Is it a particularly racist area?
2 weeks after Stephen's death in 1993, I went to South London, talked to young black men about their fears of racist attack, and to detectives already being accused of not taking the murders seriously enough. There was evident tension between police and the local black community.
The senior policeman who runs this area was telling me today that the advice he'd give you lot is to think seriously about joining the police force. He hasn't got enough.
The murder became what they call a signal crime, an event which took on a political and social dimension. Immediately after Labour's election in 1997, the government set up a public inquiry. Police had to protect 5 witnesses, men who'd been accused of involvement in the murder. But the subsequent Macpherson report pointed its finger not at suspects, but at the police.
I want this report to serve as a watershed in our attitudes to racism.
The thing that I'm proudest of as Home Secretary was setting up Lawrence, and the fact, I'm pleased to say, I was able to drive through the changes that Macpherson recommended that has had the most significant effect on the British landscape of any of the things I did.
The Metropolitan Police had been accused of institutional racism, that its structures and processes inevitably resulted in racist outcomes. Stop and search, recruitment and training were reformed. But legislation went further, requiring public bodies to eliminate discrimination and promote racial equality.
Lead and deliver a successful diversity agenda.
Some argue that the creation of a race relations industry was counterproductive.
The more that we go on about the problem of institutional racism in our public service institutions, the more it erodes the trust of the public in those institutions. And that's a heavy price to pay. It would be a price worth paying if those institutions really were badly flawed, but very often it turns out that they're not.
The English riots last August, however, are seen by some as evidence that institutional transformation has not gone far enough. Among the critics is Richard Stone, who sat on the original Lawrence inquiry panel.
I came out of the inquiry absolutely full of enthusiasm. Then what happened was it all seems to have dribbled away because the disparities in stop and search, which have doubled now, is very disappointing indeed. It creates a huge amount of anger in black communities, and also disparities in employment of black and Asian officers.
Problems still exist, but compared with 2 decades ago, Britain is much more at ease with its racial diversity. And that, in no small part, is the legacy of a teenage boy, Stephen Lawrence. Mark Easton, BBC News, South London.
Well, another of those who's been watching the campaign for justice for Stephen Lawrence and the wider ramifications for policing in Britain and racism in Britain has been Roger Grave, who's a criminologist and award-winning filmmaker on these issues. Mr. Grave, your reaction to today's events?
Well, I think it's a wonderful development at a